The radio crackled with static before the voice came through, clipped and tense. All stations, this is Overwatch. We have a situation developing in Grid Echo 73. Multiple friendlies pinned, heavy contact, requesting immediate air support. The operations center at Bagram went quiet. Every head turned toward the duty board. It was 3:47 hours, and the Hindu Kush Mountains were swallowed in darkness, so complete it felt like the earth had forgotten what light meant. Captain Reese, Valkyrie, Kine, was already awake, sitting in the pilot's ready room with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She wasn't supposed to be on the flight line tonight. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II, tail number 810964, was technically down for maintenance, a hydraulic issue that should have grounded her bird for another 6 hours. But Reese had spent the last 90 minutes in the hangar with the crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Tors who trusted her instincts more than he trusted the manual. They'd bypassed 2 safety protocols and signed off on a conditional release. Nobody questioned it. Nobody needed to. When the call came through, Reese was already walking toward the flight line, her helmet bag slung over one shoulder. She didn't run. Running suggested panic, and panic was a luxury she'd abandoned somewhere over Helmand Province 3 years prior. The air smelled like jet fuel and dust, a combination that had become more familiar to her than her own perfume. She could hear the turbofan spooling up on the other side of the tarmac, feel the low vibration humming through the concrete beneath her boots. This was the part she lived for, the moment before the chaos, when everything was still potential energy waiting to convert into something kinetic and irreversible. Valkyrie, you're not on the roster. The voice belonged to Major Hicks, the operations officer, a man who measured risk in spreadsheets and fuel calculations. He was standing outside the operations shack, tablet in hand, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. Reese didn't break stride. Tors cleared the bird, I'm mission capable. Hicks frowned, but he didn't stop her. He knew her record. Everyone did. 23 combat sorties, 17 danger-close gun runs. 0 friendly fire incidents. In a community where reputation was currency, Reese Kine was the Federal Reserve. But there was something else in his expression, something that looked almost like concern. She ignored it. The A-10 waited on the hardstand like a sleeping predator, its twin turbofan engines mounted high on the fuselage, its nose stretched long and blunt around the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon. 7 barrels, 30mm rounds, 4,000 rounds per minute. The aircraft was ugly in the way that function always trumps form, designed not to impress but to survive. Titanium bathtub around the cockpit, redundant flight systems, straight wings built for low-altitude loitering. It was a flying tank, and Reese loved it the way some people loved poetry. She completed her pre-flight in 11 minutes, her hands moving through the checklist with practiced efficiency. Fuel, hydraulics, weapons load, 2 Maverick missiles, a full drum of 30 mic, and enough flares to start a forest fire. The crew chief gave her a thumbs up from the tarmac, and Reese fired up the engines. The turbofans whined, then roared, and the whole aircraft shuddered with restrained power. She taxied toward the runway, listening to the tower frequency as another controller vectored her toward the departure corridor. Valkyrie, Bagram Tower, winds 270 at 8 knots, cleared for takeoff runway 03. Her response was immediate. Cleared for takeoff 03 Valkyrie. She pushed the throttles forward and the A-10 surged down the runway. It wasn't graceful. The Warthog never was. But when the nose lifted and the wheels left the pavement, Reese felt the familiar rush of gravity releasing its hold, the ground falling away into darkness. She banked east toward the mountains, her instruments glowing softly in the red cockpit light. Somewhere ahead, men were dying. She intended to change that equation. The terrain below was invisible, a black void punctuated by the occasional pinprick of light from a village or forward operating base. Reese climbed to 12,000 feet, high enough to avoid small arms fire, but low enough to respond quickly when the call came. Her radar warning receiver was silent. Her fuel was good. Everything was nominal except for the tight knot forming in her chest, the one that always appeared before contact. She breathed slowly, centering herself the way her first instructor had taught her. Focus on the task. Control what you can control. Accept what you cannot. Valkyrie, this is Firebird 2-1. The voice on the radio was younger than she expected, strained but holding together. Firebird 2-1 was a forward air controller embedded with a SEAL team operating somewhere in the Kunar Valley. Reese had worked with SEALs before. They didn't rattle easily, which meant whatever was happening down there was bad. Firebird Valkyrie, go ahead, she replied, keeping her voice calm and professional. There was a pause, then the sound of gunfire in the background, sharp cracks followed by the heavier thump of something larger. RPG, maybe. Valkyrie, we are danger close, say again danger close, taking heavy fire from multiple positions. We have 2 urgent surgical and 1 routine, cannot evac under current conditions. Need immediate suppression, how copy? Reese's jaw tightened. Danger close meant the enemy was within 600 meters of friendly forces, close enough that any ordnance she dropped could kill the people she was trying to save. It required precision, trust, and a willingness to operate in the margin of error where careers ended and investigations began. Good copy, Firebird. Authenticate Bravo Tango 69er. She waited while the controller checked his authentication card, confirming he was who he claimed to be and not an enemy trying to lure her into a trap. Authenticate Hotel Whiskey 23. Valkyrie, we are at grid November Delta 478-15, taking fire from ridgeline to our west and structures to our north. Estimate 20 to 30 fighters, small arms and crew-served weapons. Reese pulled up the coordinates on her moving map display, overlaying them with the terrain data stored in her system. The target area was a steep-sided valley with minimal egress routes, surrounded by high ground on 3 sides. It was a natural kill box and the SEALs had walked right into it. She adjusted her course, descending toward the combat zone. Firebird Valkyrie, I'm 5 mics out. Describe your position and mark when able. The controller's voice came back immediately. Valkyrie, we are in a dry riverbed, approximately 80 meters east of the structures. I'll mark with infrared strobe, how copy? Reese confirmed and activated her targeting pod, switching to infrared mode. The world below transformed into shades of green and black, heat signatures blooming white against the cool earth. She saw the strobe first, a rapid pulse of light invisible to the naked eye but blazing in her sensors. Clustered around it were the thermal signatures of the SEAL team, prone and tight, returning fire toward the ridgeline. Beyond them, scattered among the rocks and buildings, were the enemy fighters, their heat signatures distinct and numerous. Reese counted 26 before she stopped. Too many for a single gun run. This would require multiple passes, careful timing, and more luck than she liked to rely on. Firebird Valkyrie has your position visual. Confirm all friendlies east of the riverbed, all targets west and north. The controller confirmed, his voice tight. That's a firm, Valkyrie. Please be advised we are taking casualties. How long until you're in position? Reese checked her altitude and airspeed. 8,200 feet, 220 knots descending. 30 seconds, Firebird. Keep your heads down. She armed the GAU-8, feeling the familiar click as the weapon system came online. The gun sight illuminated on her heads-up display, a bright pipper that tracked with the movement of her aircraft. She rolled into a shallow dive, aligning the nose with the ridgeline where the majority of the enemy fire originated. The A-10 shuddered slightly, adjusting to the increased airflow as she descended through 8,000 feet. Her finger hovered over the trigger. Not yet. Wait for the geometry. Wait for the angle. 7,000 feet. The ridgeline filled her vision, jagged and dark, studded with muzzle flashes that looked like fireflies in her targeting pod. She could see individual fighters now, crouched behind rocks, firing down into the valley. Reese adjusted her aim point, leading the target slightly to account for her airspeed and descent rate. 6,000 feet. 5,000. Now. She squeezed the trigger and the GAU-8 roared to life. The sound was unlike anything else in aviation, a deep tearing noise that resonated through the airframe, vibrating her teeth and rattling her spine. 70 rounds per second poured out of the 7 barrels, each depleted uranium penetrator leaving the muzzle at 3,400 feet per second. The ridgeline exploded. Rock and dirt fountained into the air, traced by the glowing paths of the rounds as they impacted. She walked the gunfire across the enemy positions, methodical and deliberate, 5 seconds of sustained fire that chewed through stone and flesh with equal indifference. Then she released the trigger and pulled up hard, banking left to avoid overflying the target and exposing her belly to ground fire. The G-forces pressed her into the seat, her vision narrowing slightly as blood drained from her head. She grunted against the pressure, tightening her core muscles to keep herself conscious. The A-10 climbed away, engines straining, and Reese leveled off at 7,500 feet. Firebird Valkyrie off target assess. There was silence, then the sound of someone breathing hard. Valkyrie, good effects, good effects. You got most of them, but we still have fire from the structures to the north. Can you hit them? Reese circled back, repositioning for another pass. The structures were closer to the SEAL position, well within the danger close threshold. She'd have to be more precise this time, use shorter bursts and a steeper angle to minimize the risk of ricochet or overshoot. Affirm, Firebird. Stand by for second run. She rolled in again, faster this time, dropping through 7,500 feet like a falcon diving on prey. The structures resolved in her targeting pod, low mud brick buildings with flat roofs, the kind that dotted every village in Afghanistan. Muzzle flashes sparkled from the windows and rooftops, enemy fighters silhouetted against the thermal backdrop. Reese adjusted her aim, targeting the northernmost building first. She squeezed the trigger in short bursts, 3-second pulls that sent 200 rounds downrange with surgical precision. The building disintegrated, walls collapsing inward as the 30mm rounds punched through mud brick like it was paper. She shifted to the second structure, then the third, each burst calculated and controlled. The night lit up with secondary explosions as ammunition stores cooked off, bright flashes that momentarily overloaded her infrared display. Then she was pulling up again, climbing and banking, her heart pounding in her chest. Firebird Valkyrie off target, how copy? The controller's voice came back almost immediately, and this time there was something different in it. Relief maybe, or awe. Valkyrie, that's excellent work. Enemy fire has ceased. We are consolidating and preparing for medevac. You just saved our lives. Reese didn't respond right away. She was busy scanning the surrounding terrain for additional threats, checking her fuel state, ensuring the immediate area was secure. When she finally keyed the mic, her voice was as calm as if she'd just ordered coffee. Copy, Firebird. Happy to help. Valkyrie will remain on station until your medevac arrives. Advise when clear. She climbed back to altitude and entered a slow orbit over the valley, watching the thermal signatures below as the SEAL team regrouped and began tending to their wounded. The medevac helicopters arrived 14 minutes later, Black Hawks with door gunners scanning the darkness. Reese escorted them in, flying cover while they touched down and loaded the casualties. Only when the helicopters were safely away did she turn back toward Bagram, her fuel gauge reading less than comfortable but still within limits. The flight back was quiet. No radio chatter, no threats, just the steady hum of the turbofans and the dark expanse of the mountains below. Reese let herself relax incrementally, muscle by muscle, until she was simply flying, existing in the moment. When she landed at Bagram, the sun was beginning to paint the eastern horizon in shades of orange and pink. She taxied back to the hardstand, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, unwilling to break the silence. Eventually, she climbed down, her legs stiff and her back aching. Torres was waiting for her, a knowing smile on his weathered face. Heard you made some noise tonight, Captain. Reese pulled off her helmet, her hair matted with sweat. Just another day at the office, Chief. He laughed, but there was respect in his eyes. He'd been in the Air Force for 26 years, long enough to recognize the real thing when he saw it. Reese walked back to the ready room, dropped her gear, and collapsed onto the worn couch that smelled like old coffee and jet fuel. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. It never did, not right away. Instead, she replayed the mission in her mind, analyzing every decision, every turn, every trigger pull, looking for mistakes, finding none. The door opened and Major Hicks stepped inside. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at her with that same complicated expression from earlier. "The SEALs sent a message," he said finally. "They want to know your call sign. Said they owe you a beer." Reese opened one eye. "Valkyrie, it's on my helmet." Hicks nodded slowly. "They said to tell you they've worked with a lot of air support over the years, said you're the best they've seen." She closed her eye again. "They say that to everyone." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were lying, because she could feel it, that small, dangerous spark of pride warming her chest despite her best efforts to snuff it out. Hicks left without another word, and Reese was alone again with the silence and the memory of the ridgeline exploding under her guns. The missions blurred together after that night. Grid coordinates and call signs, danger close strikes and medevac escorts, the endless cycle of launching into darkness and returning at dawn. Reese flew them all with the same methodical competence, building a reputation one gun run at a time. The infantry loved her. The special operations community requested her by name. Her squadron commander recommended her for a medal, though she told him not to bother. Medals were for people who needed external validation. Reese validated herself every time she brought her aircraft home in one piece with every friendly soldier still breathing. But there were people who didn't understand. Pilots from other airframes, mostly, the fast jet crowd who measured success in Mach numbers and altitude records. They saw the A-10 as obsolete, a Cold War relic kept alive by congressional pork and nostalgic sentimentality. They saw Reese the same way, competent but unexceptional, a pilot who'd found her niche in a dying platform because she couldn't cut it in the real Air Force. They didn't say it to her face, of course. They didn't have to. She could see it in the way they looked past her at briefings, hear it in the subtle pauses when her name came up. Lieutenant Colonel Garrett was the worst of them. He flew F-15Es out of Bagram, a weapons system officer who'd never pulled a trigger in anger but loved to pontificate about air-power doctrine in the officers' club. He was tall and handsome in the way that looked good in dress blues, with a politician's smile and a bureaucrat's instinct for self-preservation. He cornered Reese one evening after a mission brief, his voice loud enough that half the room could hear. "Hey Valkyrie, heard you did some plinking last night. Must be nice, flying slow enough to actually see the ground." There was laughter, mostly from his usual crowd. Reese didn't react. She'd learned long ago that the best response to condescension was indifference. She gathered her notes and stood to leave, but Garrett wasn't finished. "Seriously though, when are they going to retire that thing? The A-10 is, what, 40 years old? 50. We've got fifth-generation fighters now. We don't need flying tanks anymore." Reese paused at the door, considering whether it was worth the energy to engage. She decided it was. "You're right, sir. The A-10 is old. So is the B-52, and we're still flying those. Age doesn't matter if the mission set still exists. And last time I checked, guys on the ground don't care how fast you are or how stealthy. They care whether you can hit what you're aiming at without killing them in the process." Garrett's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "That's all well and good for now, but the future of air power is speed and stealth. Close air support is going to be handled by drones and precision munitions from standoff range. Pilots like you are going to be obsolete." Reese met his eyes, her expression neutral. "Maybe you're right, sir. But today isn't the future. Today, there are still men bleeding in valleys who need someone overhead, and the A-10 is still the best tool for that job. When that changes, I'll be the first to admit it." She left before he could respond, aware of the eyes following her out of the room. Some were sympathetic. Others were calculating, measuring her words against Garrett's rank and influence. That night, lying in her rack, Reese thought about what he'd said. Not because she believed it, but because a part of her wondered if the rest of the Air Force believed it. If they saw her the way Garrett did, as a holdover from a previous era, clinging to relevance in an institution that was rapidly moving past her. It was an uncomfortable thought, made worse by the knowledge that she'd chosen this path deliberately. She could have transitioned to another airframe. She'd been offered. But she'd stayed with the A-10 because it mattered, because the mission mattered, and because she was genuinely good at it. That had to count for something, didn't it? The answer came 3 nights later in a way nobody expected. The call went out at 4:23 hours, troops in contact, mass casualty situation, multiple friendly units pinned down in the Pech River Valley. It was a coordinated ambush, well planned and executed, the kind that turned into legends or cautionary tales depending on how it ended. Every available asset was scrambled. F-16s, Apache gunships, AC-130 gunships, and 2 A-10s. Reese launched first, her hands moving through the startup sequence with muscle memory while her mind processed the fragmentary order crackling over the radio. 20-plus casualties, battalion-sized elements surrounded, air controllers declaring a tactical emergency. She reached the target area in 18 minutes, her targeting pod already scanning the terrain. The valley was a nightmare, narrow and steep-sided with minimal room to maneuver. The friendly forces were clustered in a small compound at the valley floor, surrounded on 3 sides by enemy fighters dug into the high ground. Tracer fire crisscrossed the darkness like angry fireflies, and explosions bloomed white-hot in her infrared display. The F-16s arrived first, screaming in at 400 knots with GPS-guided bombs. They dropped from 20,000 feet, safe and clean, and the explosions were spectacular. But when the smoke cleared, the enemy was still firing. The bombs had missed their mark, landing too far from the enemy positions to have any effect. The Apache gunships tried next, hovering at the valley entrance and unleashing Hellfire missiles. But the terrain limited their angles, and accurate fire forced them to break off before they could properly assess damage. Then the AC-130 checked in, its 105mm howitzer booming in the darkness. But the gunship orbited high and wide, constrained by the same terrain that limited everyone else. Reese listened to the radio chatter, heard the frustration building in the voices of the ground controllers as each successive strike failed to relieve the pressure. She waited her turn, studying the geometry, calculating angles and approaches that the faster aircraft couldn't manage. "Any station, this is Longbow 6 Actual." The voice was older, rougher, carrying the authority of command. Longbow 6 was the battalion commander, a full-bird colonel who'd been in the Army longer than Reese had been alive. "We are down to our last 20 minutes before we're overrun. I need someone to get in close and hit these positions on the ridgeline. Danger close, broken arrow situation. If you can't do it, tell me now so I can make other arrangements." There was silence on the frequency. The F-16s couldn't risk it. Their speed and attack profiles made precision at danger-close range nearly impossible. The gunships were taking too much fire. The AC-130 didn't have the angles. Reese keyed her mic. "Longbow 6 Valkyrie, I can make it work." There was a pause, then the colonel's voice came back, skeptical but desperate. "Valkyrie, you're the A-10." Another pause. "All right, you're cleared hot. God help us all." Reese didn't waste time with reassurances. She simply rolled in, dropping through the darkness like a stone. The ridgeline was lit up with muzzle flashes, so many she couldn't count them. Enemy fighters were shooting down into the compound with impunity, knowing they held the high ground. Reese armed her gun and steadied her breathing. This was it, the moment that would define whether she was as good as she believed or just another pilot with delusions of competence. She came in low and slow, 150 knots at 4,500 feet, well within the envelope of every weapon down there. The radar warning receiver screamed at her, detecting multiple threats, but she ignored it. Focus on the task. She aligned the gun sight with the densest cluster of muzzle flashes and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared, and the ridgeline vanished in a maelstrom of dirt and rock. She walked the fire along the entire position, methodical and relentless, 7 full seconds of sustained fire that expended nearly 500 rounds. The A-10 bucked and shuddered from the recoil, but she held it steady, willing the aircraft to obey. Then she pulled up and banked hard, clearing the ridgeline by less than 200 feet. Tracers followed her, bright lines in the darkness but none connected. She climbed back to altitude, circling for another pass. Longbow 6 Valkyrie off target assess. The colonel's response was immediate and the skepticism was gone. Valkyrie outstanding. You suppressed the north ridgeline. We need the same on the south ridgeline than the tree line to our west. Can you do it? Reese checked her ammunition counter. 3,200 rounds remaining, enough for 2 more extended bursts. Affirmed 6, rolling in now. She made 2 more passes, each one as precise as the first, chewing through enemy positions with the methodical efficiency of a surgeon wielding a chainsaw. By the time she pulled off target for the final time, the enemy fire had slackened to sporadic and ineffective. The battalion consolidated, evacuated their wounded, and broke out of the encirclement before dawn. 24 soldiers came home that night who wouldn't have otherwise. Reese knew because the colonel told her personally when she landed, waiting on the tarmac with his command sergeant major, both of them still wearing body armor and carrying rifles. They saluted her, a full-bird colonel saluting a captain, and thanked her in voices thick with emotion. Word spread fast in the military community. The SEALs who'd been on the ground that night weren't quiet about what they'd witnessed. Neither was Longbow 6, who submitted an award recommendation that described Reese's actions in language usually reserved for Medal of Honor citations. Within a week, every ground unit in Regional Command East knew the name Valkyrie and what it meant when she checked in on the frequency. She was the pilot you wanted overhead when everything went to hell, the one who could thread the needle between danger close and effective, the one who would risk her life to save yours without hesitation. The reputation was both a blessing and a burden. Reese didn't like being famous. She preferred anonymity, the ability to do her job without scrutiny. But fame in a combat zone operates on different rules than fame in the civilian world. Here, reputation was survival. When ground units trusted you, they gave better information, marked their positions more accurately, and followed your instructions without question. That trust saved lives, including hers. So she accepted the attention with the same stoic grace she applied to everything else, neither embracing it nor rejecting it, simply acknowledging it as part of the operational environment. Lieutenant Colonel Garrett stopped making jokes about the A-10 after the Petch River Valley incident. He didn't apologize. That would have required a level of self-awareness he didn't possess, but he stopped talking, which was almost as good. The deployments continued. Reese rotated home, spent 4 months at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, then deployed again. And again. By her 5th deployment, she'd flown over 100 combat sorties, more than most pilots flew in an entire career. She became the old hand, the experienced operator that younger pilots looked to for guidance. She taught them the things the training syllabus didn't cover: how to read terrain at night, how to work with ground controllers under stress, how to manage fear and fatigue in equal measure. She was good at it, better than she expected. Teaching forced her to articulate instincts she developed subconsciously, to break down complex tasks into digestible components. But the war was changing. The big conventional fights were over, replaced by a grinding counterinsurgency that relied less on air power and more on patience and cultural understanding. Missions became fewer and further between. The A-10 community contracted as budgets tightened and priorities shifted. Reese watched friends transition to other airframes or leave the service entirely, chasing civilian careers that paid better and demanded less. She stayed. Partly out of loyalty to the mission, partly out of stubborn refusal to admit that Garrett might have been right about the future, and partly because she didn't know how to be anything other than a combat pilot. Her 6th deployment was supposed to be routine. Train the Afghan Air Force, fly the occasional patrol, mentor the next generation of pilots who would eventually take over the mission. It was nation-building 101, the kind of deployment you did when you were winding down a career, not building one. Reese accepted it without complaint because complaining accomplished nothing. She landed at Kandahar Airfield on a scorching afternoon in July, the heat radiating off the tarmac in visible waves, and settled into yet another cramped containerized housing unit that smelled like disinfectant and old sweat. The routine was familiar: morning briefs, afternoon flights, evening debriefs, then sleep until the next day started. It was on her 9th day in country that the emergency call came through. A joint NATO convoy had hit an IED in Zabul province, triggering a complex ambush that left vehicles disabled and soldiers scattered across open terrain. The Afghan Air Force couldn't respond. Their helicopters were grounded for maintenance. The American medevac birds were already committed to another mission. That left Reese and her wingman, a young captain named Ortiz who'd been in country for less than a month. They launched within 12 minutes, climbing into the brutal midday sun that turned the cockpit into an oven despite the environmental control system. The target area was 40 minutes away, and every second counted. When they arrived, the situation was worse than reported. The convoy had been carrying Polish and American special forces, experienced operators who'd been ambushed by an enemy force that was larger, better equipped, and more coordinated than anything Reese had seen in years. The attackers were using mortars, machine guns, and RPGs in a coordinated assault that suggested professional training. The NATO forces were pinned in a dry wadi, vehicles burning, ammunition running low. "Valkyrie, this is Sabre 1-6. We are in serious trouble here." The controller's accent was thick, Eastern European, his English strained but functional. "We have multiple casualties, cannot move, taking fire from all sides. Please help." Reese scanned the battlefield through her targeting pod. She could see the enemy positions clearly, dug into compounds and tree lines in a horseshoe formation around the wadi. There had to be 50 or 60 fighters, maybe more, all of them firing with a discipline that suggested military training rather than tribal militia. This wasn't the Taliban. This was something else, something more dangerous. She armed her weapons and briefed Ortiz on the plan. They'd work in pairs, alternating runs to keep constant pressure on the enemy while managing their fuel and ammunition. It was textbook close air support, the kind they'd practiced 100 times in training. Except training never included the smell of burning flesh or the sound of dying men screaming over the radio. Reese rolled in first, targeting the northern compound where the heaviest fire originated. She released a Maverick missile at 2 miles, watching the smoke trail arc downward and impact with a bloom of orange fire. The compound collapsed, walls imploding from the overpressure. She followed up with the gun, strafing the tree line to the west, her rounds impacting so close to the friendly position that she could see debris falling on the NATO troops. Sabre, Valkyrie off target. The controller's response was immediate. Good hit, keep it coming." Ortiz followed her in, delivering his own Maverick on the southern position, then pulling up and repositioning. They worked the target area for 30 minutes, expending every weapon on both aircraft until all they had left were cannons and determination. The enemy fire slackened, then stopped entirely as the survivors withdrew into the surrounding villages. Medevac helicopters arrived, extracted the wounded, and disappeared back toward Kandahar. Reese orbited overhead until the convoy was mobile again, nursing her fuel and ignoring the warning lights flashing on her caution panel. Only when the convoy reached the safety of a nearby forward operating base did she turn for home, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. The Polish commander sent a case of vodka to her squadron with a note written in broken English. "For Valkyrie, you are warrior in Valhalla, thank you for our life." Reese accepted it with embarrassment, uncomfortable with gratitude she felt she didn't deserve. She'd just done her job, same as always. But the Poles didn't see it that way, and neither did anyone else who'd been in that wadi. To them, she was something more than a pilot. She was a guardian angel with a gun. The phone call came 3 weeks later. She was in the ready room, reading a paperback novel she'd found in the exchange, when the operations officer handed her a sat phone with an apologetic expression. "Captain Kine, someone wants to talk to you. Says it's important." Reese took the phone, expecting another routine call from higher headquarters. Instead, the voice on the other end was female, professional, and very serious. "Captain Kine, this is Colonel Andrea Moss from Headquarters Air Combat Command. Do you have a few minutes?" Reese straightened unconsciously. "Yes, ma'am." There was a pause, the kind that comes before life-changing news. "Captain, I'm calling to inform you that you've been selected for attendance at the Air Force Weapons School." The Weapons School, fighter pilot graduate school, the most demanding aviation training program in the world. Only the top 1% of pilots were selected, and the attrition rate was brutal. Reese had applied twice before and been rejected both times, told politely that her record was impressive but not quite exceptional. Now apparently someone had changed their mind. "Ma'am, thank you, I'm honored." Colonel Moss's voice softened slightly. "Don't thank me yet, Captain. You've got 6 months to prepare, and when you get here, we're going to push you harder than you've ever been pushed. But your record speaks for itself. You've earned this opportunity. Don't waste it." Reese returned home and threw herself into preparation with single-minded intensity. She studied tactics manuals, memorized threat systems, and flew every training mission like it was combat. Her squadron commander gave her carte blanche to train however she needed, and she used it ruthlessly, logging more hours than any other pilot in the unit. When she finally reported to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, she was as ready as she could be. The weapons school was everything they'd promised and worse: 18-hour days, impossible standards, instructors who treated mistakes like capital crimes. Half her class washed out in the first month. Reese survived through sheer stubbornness and a refusal to accept failure. Graduation came 6 months later on a bright morning in the Nevada desert. She stood on the flight line in her dress blues, the weapons school patch sewn onto her shoulder, surrounded by classmates who'd become brothers and sisters through shared suffering. Her parents were there, proud and uncomfortable in a world they didn't understand. Her father, a retired postal worker, kept asking questions about the aircraft parked nearby. Her mother just cried and hugged her for a long time without saying anything. Reese accepted their love awkwardly, unsure how to bridge the gap between the person they'd raised and the person she'd become. She returned to Davis-Monthan as a weapons officer, the tactical expert responsible for training the squadron and advising the commander on employment concepts. It was a position of influence and responsibility, and Reese attacked it with characteristic intensity. She rewrote the training syllabus, implemented new tactics, and mentored young pilots with a combination of high standards and genuine care. Her squadron flourished under her guidance, winning awards and accolades that reflected the culture she'd built. But the deployments continued, and with each one, the A-10 community shrank a little more. Bases closed. Squadrons deactivated. The aircraft that had defined her career was being phased out, slowly but inexorably, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her 8th deployment was to Syria. Not officially, of course. The United States wasn't at war with Syria, at least not in any way that required congressional approval. But there were special operations forces on the ground fighting ISIS, and they needed air support, and the A-10 was still the best tool for the job. Reese flew out of an undisclosed location somewhere in the region, launching into hostile airspace with call signs she couldn't discuss and supporting operations she'd never be allowed to acknowledge. It was shadow war, the kind that happened in the margins of public awareness, and it was brutal in ways Afghanistan had never been. The enemy here was different. ISIS fighters were fanatical but poorly trained, often high on drugs and willing to die for causes they barely understood. But they were numerous and embedded in civilian populations, which made every strike a test of judgment and precision. Reese flew missions where the difference between a legitimate target and a war crime was measured in meters, where hesitation got people killed and haste got her court-martialed. She navigated that razor's edge with the same cold competence she applied to everything, earning the trust of the special operations community and the quiet respect of her peers. It was during this deployment that she earned the second half of her legend. The mission started like dozens before it, a small special operations team trapped in a fortified compound, surrounded by ISIS fighters who were methodically collapsing the perimeter. Reese launched alone. Her wingman was down with maintenance issues. By the time she reached the target area, the situation had deteriorated beyond recognition. The team was out of ammunition, down to fighting with captured weapons and improvised explosives. The ISIS fighters were breaching the walls. The team leader, call sign Reaper 36, was matter-of-fact when he keyed the radio. "Valkyrie, we're not getting out of this. Do what you can, but don't risk yourself. We're already dead." Reese ignored him. She rolled in on the first pass at 300 feet above ground level, so low she could see individual faces staring up at her. The gun roared and bodies disintegrated. She pulled up, banked hard, and rolled in again from a different angle. Again. And again. 12 passes in 17 minutes, each one threading between rooftops and power lines, each one closer than the last. Her airframe took hits, small arms fire punching through the wings and tail, alarms screaming in the cockpit. She ignored all of it. The team on the ground was fighting for their lives, and she was the only thing standing between them and death. On the 13th pass, her hydraulic system failed. The flight controls went stiff, requiring all her strength to manipulate. She should have aborted, headed for friendly airspace before the aircraft became unflyable. Instead, she made 3 more passes, coaxing the dying aircraft through turns it shouldn't have been able to make, delivering accurate fire until the ISIS assault collapsed and the fighters withdrew. Only then did she turn toward base, nursing the crippled A-10 through the sky while reciting emergency procedures and calculating whether she had enough control authority to land. The tower cleared her straightened approach, fire trucks rolling to meet her. She touched down hard, the aircraft slamming onto the runway and veering left as the damaged flight controls failed completely. She stood on the brakes, felt them grab, then felt them fade as the hydraulic pressure dropped to 0. The A-10 rolled off the runway into the dirt, finally stopping 50 meters short of the perimeter fence. Reese shut down the engines, unstrapped, and climbed out of the cockpit on legs that barely supported her weight. The crew chief who met her stared at the aircraft in disbelief. It was a wreck, riddled with holes, hydraulic fluid leaking from a dozen punctures. "Captain, how the hell did you fly this thing back?" Reese looked at the aircraft, then at him, too exhausted to summon a proper answer. "Carefully, Chief, very carefully." The special operations team she'd saved sent her a gift, a combat knife with her call sign engraved on the blade and a note that simply said, "Reaper 36, I owe you everything." She kept it in her locker, next to her helmet and the other small totems that marked her journey. The awards followed: the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, the Air Medal with Combat Device, commendations from allied nations she couldn't name publicly. Reese accepted them with the same quiet humility she applied to everything, refusing interviews and deflecting attention whenever possible. But the story spread anyway, passed from unit to unit, embellished and mythologized until it barely resembled the truth. She became a legend whether she wanted to be or not, the pilot whose name carried weight in communities that didn't give respect easily. And with that legend came expectations she never asked for and couldn't escape. Her 9th deployment was her last, not because she chose to end it, but because the Air Force made the choice for her. The A-10 was finally being retired in earnest, the fleet drawn down to a skeleton force that would be maintained for a few more years before being mothballed entirely. Reese's squadron was on the deactivation list. She could transition to another aircraft, they told her. The F-35 needed experienced instructors. Or she could move into staff work, leveraging her combat experience to shape future doctrine. Both options were honorable. Both options felt like betrayal. She requested retirement instead, effective at the end of her deployment, and the Air Force granted it without argument. Her final mission was supposed to be ceremonial, a farewell flight with her squadron, a victory lap over the desert before returning to base and hanging up her helmet for the last time. But wars don't respect ceremony, and the call came through at 3:12 hours on what should have been her last day. American forces ambushed in Nangarhar province. Mass casualties. Urgent request for close air support. Reese was already dressed, already walking toward the flight line before the alert was officially transmitted. She knew every other pilot in the squadron would let her take this one, the final mission, the last time she'd climb into an A-10 and do the thing she was born to do. The mission was textbook, almost anticlimactic. She arrived on station, worked with the ground controller, delivered precise fires that broke the ambush and allowed the convoy to withdraw. No drama, no heroics, just competence applied with professional efficiency. But as she climbed away from the target area and turned toward base, watching the sun rise over the mountains, she felt something inside her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd done everything she could, and it had been enough. The wars would continue without her. Other pilots would take her place. But for this moment in this aircraft, she had been exactly what the world needed her to be. She landed at dawn, taxied to the parking spot, and shut down the engines for the last time. The squadron was waiting, 50 people lined up along the taxiway with their hands raised in salute. Reese climbed down from the cockpit, removed her helmet, and walked between the lines toward the operations building. Nobody spoke. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter, more solemn, the acknowledgement of something ending that could never be replaced. When she reached the end of the line, her squadron commander was waiting. Colonel Marcus Hill, a veteran pilot who'd flown with her on 3 deployments. He extended his hand and she shook it. "You set the standard, Valkyrie. Every pilot in this squadron knows what right looks like because of you." Reese nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She'd never been good with emotions, especially her own. Hill seemed to understand. He stepped aside and Reese walked into the operations building, hung her helmet on the peg that had been hers for the last 8 months, and walked away. Behind her, the A-10 sat silent on the ramp, its guns cold, its war finally over. She didn't look back. Looking back served no purpose. The transition to civilian life was harder than combat. At least in combat, the rules were clear. Accomplish the mission. Protect your teammates. Come home alive. Civilian life had no such clarity. Reese took a job as a test pilot with a defense contractor, flying experimental aircraft and providing feedback to engineers who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. The work was interesting but bloodless, lacking the urgency and purpose that had defined her military career. She lasted 18 months before quitting, unable to reconcile the person she'd become with the person the job required. She moved to Montana, bought a small house near the mountains, and tried to figure out who Reese Kine was when she wasn't Captain Kine, combat pilot. The answer eluded her. She filled her days with mundane tasks, grocery shopping, hiking, reading books she'd never had time for during her military career. She avoided other veterans, unwilling to relive the past or explain herself to people who already knew the stories. Isolation became her default state, comfortable and suffocating in equal measure. Months passed, then years. She told herself she was content. She almost believed it. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. The subject line read simply, "You're invited." Reese almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something made her open it. The message was from the Air Force Academy, inviting her to speak at their annual symposium on combat aviation. They wanted her to talk about her experiences, share lessons learned, inspire the next generation of pilots. Reese's first instinct was to decline. She wasn't a public speaker. She didn't have wisdom to impart. But the email included a personal note from the symposium director, a brigadier general she'd served with years earlier. "Reese, your story matters. There are young women at this academy who need to hear it. Please consider." She flew to Colorado Springs on a cold morning in April, uncomfortable in civilian clothes that felt foreign after decades in uniform. The academy was exactly as she remembered it, imposing, beautiful, intimidating. She met with the symposium director, rehearsed her remarks, and tried not to think about the 200 cadets who'd be in the audience. When the time came, she walked onto the stage, stood behind the podium, and looked out at the sea of young faces staring back at her. They were so young, she thought, so eager and unaware of what lay ahead. She opened her mouth to speak and found her throat tight with emotion. "My name is Reese Kine. My call sign was Valkyrie. I flew Thunderbolts for 12 years and 9 deployments. I'm here to tell you that everything they told you about combat aviation is both true and completely wrong." She paused, letting the contradiction hang in the air. "It's true that you'll experience moments of incredible intensity and clarity, where everything you've trained for comes together and you perform at a level you didn't know you were capable of. It's true that you'll save lives and make differences that matter, but what they don't tell you is that you'll also fail. You'll make mistakes. You'll second-guess every decision, and you'll carry those moments with you long after your flying career is over." She spoke for 40 minutes, telling stories she'd never shared publicly. The Pech River Valley, the Syrian compound, the final mission at dawn. But she also talked about the failures, the times she'd been too slow, too cautious, too aggressive. The missions where, despite her best efforts, people still died. She talked about the cost of service, not just the physical wounds but the psychological ones, the way combat changes you in ways you can't articulate and other people can't understand. When she finished, the auditorium was silent. Then one cadet stood and began to applaud. Then another. Then the entire room was on its feet, the sound overwhelming. Afterward, a young female cadet approached her, barely 18 years old, with determination blazing in her eyes. "Ma'am, I want to fly the A-10. Can you tell me how to get selected?" Reese looked at her, saw herself 2 decades earlier, and felt something crack inside her chest. "The A-10 is being retired," she said gently. "By the time you're operational, it won't exist anymore." The cadet's face fell, but only for a moment. "Then I'll fly whatever they need me to fly. But I'll fly it the way you did for the people on the ground." Reese smiled despite herself. "Then you're going to be just fine, cadet, better than fine." She drove back to Montana that night, the mountains dark silhouettes against the starlit sky. The drive gave her time to think, to process emotions she'd been suppressing for years. The symposium had opened something inside her, a realization that her story wasn't finished just because her flying career was over. She had knowledge, experience, perspective that could help the next generation avoid her mistakes and build on her successes. Teaching had always been part of her identity, even when she didn't recognize it. Maybe it was time to embrace that more fully. Within 6 months, Reese had accepted a position as an instructor at the Air Force Weapons School, teaching the next generation of weapons officers the tactics and techniques she'd developed over a career of combat operations. It felt right in ways the civilian world never had, giving her purpose and connection to something larger than herself. She was demanding but fair, pushing her students hard because she knew the stakes. The pilots who graduated from her course would go on to lead combat missions, make life-and-death decisions, and shape the future of air power. She owed them nothing less than her best. Years passed. Reese's hair grayed at the temples. Her reflexes slowed incrementally. But her mind remained sharp, her knowledge deep, her commitment unwavering. She watched as the A-10 was finally retired completely, the last aircraft flying a ceremonial final sortie before being towed to the boneyard in Arizona. She attended the ceremony, standing among the crowd of current and former A-10 pilots, and felt a grief she couldn't articulate. It was more than saying goodbye to an aircraft. It was acknowledging that an entire era had ended, and the warriors who defined that era were slowly fading into history. But even as one chapter closed, another opened. The lessons Reese had learned in the A-10, the importance of precision, the value of persistence, the necessity of being present for the people depending on you, those lessons transcended any single aircraft or mission set. They were universal principles that applied to any form of combat aviation, any leadership challenge, any moment when competence and courage were required. Reese taught those principles relentlessly, embedding them in the DNA of every pilot who passed through her classroom. They called her the legend behind her back, a nickname she pretended not to hear but secretly appreciated. One evening, sitting in her office at Nellie's, Reese received a package with no return address. Inside was a combat knife, not her knife, the one Reaper 36 had given her, but a new one. The blade was inscribed with words that made her throat tight. Valkyrie, you taught us how to be warriors and how to be human. Your legacy lives in every pilot who learned from you. The class of 2024. Beneath the inscription were 30 signatures, every student from her most recent class. Reese set the knife on her desk and sat staring at it for a long time, emotions warring inside her. She'd spent so much of her career focused on the mission, on the immediate task of keeping people alive and accomplishing objectives. She'd never thought much about legacy, about what would remain after she was gone. But sitting there in the quiet office, she realized that legacy wasn't something you planned or controlled. It was simply the sum of all the lives you touched, all the lessons you taught, all the moments when you'd chosen to do the right thing even when it was hard. Her legacy wasn't the missions she'd flown or the medals she'd earned. It was the pilots who'd learned from her example and carried those lessons forward into their own careers. The next morning, Reese stood in front of a new class of students, 40 pilots selected from across the combat air forces. They looked at her with a mixture of respect and nervousness, aware of her reputation but uncertain what to expect. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're here because you're good," she said. "But good isn't enough. The enemy is good too." The difference between success and failure in combat aviation is often measured in seconds and inches. We're going to spend the next 6 months teaching you how to operate in those margins, how to make perfect decisions under imperfect conditions. It's going to be hard. Some of you won't make it, but those who do will be ready for anything. She paused, making eye contact with each student. "I flew A-10s for 12 years. I loved that aircraft and I was good at what I did. But the A-10 is gone now and I'm still here because the principles I learned transcend any single platform. Precision, persistence, accountability, courage. Those are the traits that define effective combat aviation, regardless of what you fly or where you fly it. My job is to instill those traits in you, and your job is to take them forward and pass them on to the next generation. That's how we honor the people who came before us and ensure the mission continues long after we're gone." The class absorbed her words in silence. Then a hand went up, a young lieutenant with pilot wings and a weapons school student patch on his flight suit. "Ma'am, I heard you once flew a crippled aircraft back to base after taking fire in Syria. Is that true?" Reese considered the question, weighing how much to share. "It's true," she said finally. "But the part people forget is that I almost didn't make it. I came within 50 meters of crashing and destroying a multi-million-dollar aircraft because I pushed too hard and stayed too long. I got lucky. The aircraft held together just long enough. But luck isn't a tactic, and it's not something you can rely on." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "Every time I tell that story, I emphasize the mistakes I made, not the heroics. Because heroics get you killed and dead pilots don't save anyone. What kept me alive, and what kept the people on the ground alive, was training, discipline, and a willingness to operate at the edge of my capabilities without crossing into recklessness. That's what I'm going to teach you. Not how to be heroes, but how to be professionals who get the job done and come home alive." The students nodded, and Reese saw understanding dawn in their eyes. They'd come expecting war stories and glory. Instead, they were getting something more valuable, the accumulated wisdom of someone who'd survived long enough to learn from her mistakes. That was the real gift she could offer, not inspiration but preparation, not mythology but truth. As the class began, Reese felt the familiar sense of purpose settling over her like a well-worn flight suit. This was where she belonged. Not in the cockpit anymore, but here, shaping the next generation, ensuring that the lessons written in blood and sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could still hear the sound of the GAU-8 roaring, feel the aircraft shuddering beneath her, see the mountains falling away into darkness as she climbed toward the stars. Those memories would fade eventually, softened by time and distance. But the essence of what they represented, the commitment to service, the refusal to abandon those who depended on her, the willingness to risk everything for something larger than herself, that would remain. Not just in her, but in every pilot she taught, every lesson she passed on, every moment when someone chose courage over comfort because she'd shown them how. The legacy of Valkyrie wasn't a single pilot or a single aircraft. It was an idea that excellence in service requires both competence and compassion, that the best warriors are those who fight not for glory but for the people beside them, and that true leadership means lifting others up even when it costs you personally. Reese Kine had lived that idea for decades, first in combat and now in teaching, and she would continue living it until the day she could no longer stand in front of a classroom. Because that's what warriors did. They served, they sacrificed, they endured, and when their time in the cockpit was over, they found new ways to contribute, new battles to fight, new lives to touch. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of tracer fire and flares, Reese Kine smiled. The war was over. The aircraft was gone. But the mission continued and she was still part of it. That was enough. It had always been enough.